with medication. The second 15 minutes is part 2. That will be Matthew Morrissey speaking about separateness and fusion, and also presenting 2 scenarios. And the third part, which is a question, so there'll be a chance at the end to actually ask questions verbally. That's a 15-minute section. These are all rough times. I think we can go a little bit longer than 45 minutes. It's not totally strict, but this is the rough timing. So, Christine, I'm ready to go. So next slide. So, for the first part, in the first slide, it's about boundaries. And I chose boundaries as a key topic for this subject because it's one of the most difficult things that really gets in the way of helping people get well and also helping families. So the first thing that I wanted to say about boundaries is who's going through some sort of crisis, a crisis that could be labeled as a psychiatric problem, we have to remember that we're dealing with an adult. And so often the problem with the mental health system in the United States is that right away when someone starts going through a serious emotional crisis, a spiritual crisis, the kind that gets labeled as a serious psychiatric problem, the system treats people like a child, and it tells them in so many ways that they're like a child, that the world knows what's best for you. We want to do things for your own good. Right away, the system starts providing all sorts of different interventions and ideas and things to help that are based on telling someone what to do. And right away, in my experience, that's coming at it from the wrong angle. Because to me, the most important thing is to remember that, assuming we are dealing with someone who's a chronological adult, an adult, even if they seem to not be behaving exactly like an adult, that we're interacting with someone who is actually an adult. And there's a lot of things that go along with interacting with someone who is an adult. And that's to remember that adults can make their own decisions, that adults become more responsible for facing consequences for their actions, and that part of the way to deal with an adult is to respect them. And part of respecting people is to have our own limits and to be able to set limits effectively, sometimes to say no. And what I thought of when I was preparing for this presentation was a program that I was in, and I'm not actually here to promote that program at all, but I'm not actually a part of it anymore, but I was a part of Al-Anon, which is a program for families of people who are alcoholics. And a huge part of Al-Anon is learning about having respect for people, treating other people as extremely difficult to put into practice in many times, which is why so many people actually go to programs like Al-Anon, or why people have to reach out for help when they're dealing with someone else who's in a crisis. Because often the triggered response is to do the exact opposite, to come in and to try to fix somebody's life. And it really, what I've observed is it really just doesn't work very well to jump into someone's life. And by sending them the wrong message that they're a child who needs to be taken care of, actually it works very much against, in the first hand, it works against actually helping them find their own sense of agency and autonomy. But the second part of it is it can make us nuts. It could actually, like, we start going crazy trying to fix them, and we forget that we're actually a person in this also, and that we need help. So Christine, the next slide, please. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on. Okay, here we are. The next slide. So the next slide, for me, the idea is about setting an example for getting support and being self-respecting. So a key for working with people who are having their own sort of crisis, and when we're intimately involved with them and we really love them, in my experience, the best way to do it is to start by really taking care of ourselves, really loving ourselves. And in essence, what we do is we model for them what will be helping, what we assume would be helping them the most. So how do we do that? as I see it, we start to get support for ourselves. We reach out to people who can be useful to us. We start acknowledging that this is actually extremely difficult for us and that we need help. And when we start building support, we begin a whole process of respecting ourselves and individuals, and we actually put energy into our own growth. Often what I've seen with people who are trying to help their loved ones is they actually stop taking care of themselves, they stop getting support, and instead they use their whole sense of self to devote themselves to being a support for the other person. And to me, it's not very effective when it happens that way. Instead, when we really focus on ourselves and start really loving ourselves, growing, living as healthy a life as we can, as we can manage, we set a really, really good example. And also, one thing that can be very helpful is we actually get out of the other person's business. And often that can be very, very useful. Another part of this is that if we feel our love is concerned, one thing that I've seen that can be very useful to people is that when people feel their loved one needs therapy and doesn't want it, they can just go themselves. And often there's resistance to this. It's scary. People get nervous. They don't want to go. They feel like, why should I go? The other person is the one who needs the help. But what I've observed is when the person starts going to therapy themselves, that we start going to therapy, we actually begin to change. We get a new mindset. We get a whole new set of insights. And we can actually become useful in a much more gentle and respectful way. Also, it's vital to recognize our own limits, to be aware of when we're helping and when we're not. That's not easy, because a lot of times when there's a crisis going on, there's so much fear and energy, sometimes anger, there's sadness, there's grief, there can be guilt going on. Focus on ourselves, when we start healing ourselves and putting our energy into ourselves, we become much more useful at realizing when we're being useful. The next part is studying our own motivations. This is a tough one because often our motivations are very, very complex. I found for me personally that when I do therapy or when I do my own self-therapy, it gives me a chance to sort of clear the dust and to see what my own motivations are. And often what I found when I'm trying to be helpful to someone else is that my motivations aren't always so crystal clear and perfect. Sometimes they're complex. Sometimes they're actually contradictory. And the useful thing is not that we solve all of our motivations, but just that we know what they are. And this could be very, very helpful. The next part is when they're trying to help a loved one, like a child, they're motivated by guilt. And guilt is a really tough one, because what I found is when people are motivated by guilt, they really limit their ability to be useful. And sometimes it's actually, in a way, it's sort of acting out, and it's, in essence, it's not being as helpful as they could. And so what I like to say to people when I see that they're being motivated by guilt, or when they discover they're being motivated to help by guilt, is that actually they pull back from the other person's life, sometimes pull back quite a bit, and start trying to work with their own guilt. Learn where is their guilt coming from. If they did things that maybe realistically they should be feeling guilty about, then they have to work with that in the past to find out why they did those things, and to learn that often, even if people did things that weren't useful to someone else, that they did those things for a reason, and that once they can start forgiving to another person. Also, sometimes I've seen people who feel really, really guilty about their loved one, but what I've seen is sometimes they actually really shouldn't be that guilty, and that their guilt is inappropriate. In that case, it's like they need people who are outside of their system to really help them see, your guilt is really not deserved. You really shouldn't be feeling so guilty, and that's another reason to stop being motivated by guilt, because really guilt does reduce our ability to benefit a person in crisis. So now we're ready for the next one. Thanks, Christine. The fourth part of boundaries, and this is just a short part, and this is what I just call simply hope. Hope, hope, hope. That every situation does have hope. And I think part of the reason so many people even would come on this webinar is that situations really can feel hopeless where we can't help them. And it's very hard to keep that sense of hope. But I sometimes wonder, where do I get my hope from? And a big part of where I get my hope from is just having observed people who I felt hopeless about and sometimes even gave up on, and having watched them change, having watched them grow, and having watched them actually begin to get help for themselves. And I think a big problem in the mental health system in the United States is that the whole paradigm is essentially hopeless. It's a take your medication, get on disability, you're never going to get well, you have a brain problem sort of paradigm. And I think we really need to surround ourselves by hopeful stories, to know people, to reach out to people who have actually gotten well, to reach out to who have seen people get well. Also, to read literature. And for me, this hopefulness is an incredibly motivating thing for me, because also just having heard so many stories of people who have gotten well and hearing all the details and hearing the principles of why they've gotten well, one thing I've learned is that yes, people can be helpful, but really it's going to come from that person themselves, from within. So our job is, if we can help motivate another person and catalyze them to get better, that's great. But if what we're doing is not working, a lot of times we really can find it most useful to back off, to work on ourselves, and basically put the ball in their court. And what I've observed is that when the ball really is in somebody's court, often they have really no choice, or being given up on by everybody, have finally found themselves in the midst of that. Not that I'm advocating for rejecting people, because often that's the opposite of what people need, but these are really complex issues, and different situations require different things. But for me, whenever I'm talking with someone, whenever I'm working with someone, as long as I see somebody still alive, there's always going to be hope. And there always is something new to try. And for me, it's about looking within myself to find that. So on to the next part, Christine. Medications. Medications, even talking about it is tricky. I mean, to even put this in this webinar, there's always a bit of risk involved, because it's sort of like the elephant in the living room that no one talks about when we're dealing with serious problems. But for me, I find it vital to talk about it, because I've actually almost never seen a situation with someone having a serious emergency and really aren't front and center in some way. Whether to take them, whether not to take them, to how to get off them, how to try to get off them, what happens if people try to get off them. So the first thing that I just always remember is that taking psychiatric drugs is risky, and especially the antipsychotics. They're very, very difficult to get off of. They're difficult to withdraw from. A lot of people have a very, very hard time getting off them if they want to. So knowing the risk, and also knowing the research that says, well, they do help some people, but a lot of people they really, really don't. And a lot of people they harm incredibly. My first thing is, if at all possible, and this seems to me just logical, if at all possible, at the very beginning of a crisis, avoid them. And try any alternative before medication to me, especially any non-biological alternative. If a person is willing to try an alternative, I hope they get the chance somehow. Don't solve your problems without them. There's just something about taking a pill that says, I can't do it, I need this pill to help me. And to me, there's a hopelessness in that message. Now, of course, there can be times where this is not always the final result, meaning that sometimes people do find medications useful in their process. But what I've seen for people, especially the people who have gotten well and are off their medication, so many have said the medications were not useful. And they certainly did induce a sort of hopelessness, aside from the side effects that can come from the medication. So one thing I say, I mean, I feel like I'm coming across very, very anti-medication, and in some way I am. because I think if someone can do it without pills, it's a great thing. But the next thing is just to find clinicians who know about alternatives. What I've seen is so many family members don't know how to get in touch with clinicians who know, because there's so really are good alternatives that are available. So especially if people don't live in places where there are alternatives working. What does someone do if they're in Nebraska, or they're in Wyoming, or they're somewhere in a rural area where there's just nothing? But at least there are people who one can talk to who know about alternatives, and sometimes alternatives that can even happen within the family. So the next section, please. The second part of medication that I'm a strong supporter of is that a person has a right to make his or her own decisions about medication. And to me, it's pretty simple. If a person has made up his or her mind that he wants to take medication, no matter what my point of view is, it's not my place to say don't do it. Maybe I could present a few alternatives. I can maybe give a little bit of information. But if that person does not want to see that information, it's no longer basic respect. On the other hand, if someone says they don't want to take medication, I also think it's their right to certainly not have to take them if they don't want to. And as a therapist or as a family member or as a friend, I think it certainly behooves us to be as useful as we can to try to help someone find alternatives. If they want it, we should try to help. The problem is, in our modern era, medications are given out so freely and alternatives don't even exist all that often. It's very, very difficult. The basic job is that our job is to respect their decision, and whether or not we agree with it. And ultimately, part of that is respecting their decision is that if it doesn't go well, they get the opportunity to learn from having made a mistake. Or maybe it's not even a mistake. Maybe it's just something that will fuel their progress. Consequences, that's just part of being an adult. And so as we're getting closer to the end, the first thing that I think here is about becoming really informed about aspects of recovery and medication. There certainly is no lack of information out there, especially in the era of the internet. There's lots and lots and lots of stuff readily available at our fingertips, so we can really know what we're talking about. And there's lots of great books out there, and I'll talk about some of them in a moment. Next point is pressuring people to take or not to take medication is infantilizing, and that does produce terrible emotional side effects. I think really to pressure someone to do something, and in this case specifically medication, it's just something that can be very, very hurtful, especially when someone is vulnerable and in a crisis. Then I think it's certainly good already how informed they are. I presume a lot of people are. But what I've seen is that some people who are very, very informed about the dangers of medication can still alienate their children. And I've all too often seen parents who are very, very strongly with a progressive idea that medications can be dangerous, and the child wants to take them. And again, in that case, it's just about respect and letting the child do what they feel is best for them. The next part is that people in crisis often feel betrayed by those who want to help them. And this is something that takes a lot of time to work back with, to rebuild trust. It's not, sometimes trust takes years to rebuild. Sometimes it takes decades. And we can't expect that to happen too quickly. For me, it's like when I've done things that have betrayed people's trust, it's like the best thing that I've done. And really become a more mature new person, to really study myself, do my own therapy with myself, get help, so that I can really be useful at understanding myself better and then not making the same mistakes again. And then when people see that we're not making the same mistakes again, I think it naturally does help us. So finally, I just put down a few sample books that I think could be very useful. The first one is by Peter Bregan, Your Drug May Be Your Problem. Many of his books are extremely useful. They do certainly point out the dangers of conventional psychiatry and medication, and whether or not a person agrees with everything he's saying entirely, I think they're an excellent resource. The second one is the Icarus Project and Will Hall's book, The Heart, on the internet, and I would recommend it to anyone. It's just a really, to me, it's the best book out there, and it's not really that long. The third book is Robert Whitaker's Anatomy of an Epidemic, and basically anything by Robert Whitaker is going to be excellent, in my opinion. To me, this is real evidence-based research. And the last point I want to make before I close my presentation is that before we go and spend lots and lots of money on helping a family member, which happens all too frequently, I think it behooves us to really do some consultation, do our research, know what we're getting into beforehand, so we can really make an informed choice about how we're going to be helpful. So for that, I hope this has been useful, and we're ready to move on to the second part of this webinar, which is Matthew Morrissey's section. And so I now turn this over to Matthew, and thanks a lot.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Great. So, hello everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day to join us here. Daniel just gave an excellent overview of the many issues involved in navigating a crisis successfully. So in my presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to really hone in on a specific dynamic that we all struggle with whenever we try and support someone in a crisis. This dynamic is the great psychological polarity between fusion and separateness. So let's start with definitions. Here's what I mean by the term fusion. I say that we become psychologically fused with each other when we can't quite say the boundaries that make us individuals melt away in fusion. We feel the other person's feelings as if they are our own, and then we take action based on the other person's feelings. The most common and positive examples of fusion are falling in love and parenting a newborn baby. Fusion in these states is natural and appropriate. But as we can see, fusion has a downside. We can easily lose a sense of who we are in the other person. Now let's talk about separateness. By separateness, I don't mean being aloof and distant. I mean staying engaged with someone while maintaining a certain mindset. This mindset, the ability while also keeping a place open for our own separate reactions. We're separate when we allow room for a set of feelings or thoughts to unfold which are different from what the other person is going through. We're separate when we're able to keep our own needs and priorities in mind while also balancing the other person's needs. Therefore, we can truly respond to a situation instead of merely reacting to it. Fusion and separateness are the two poles of human relatedness, and I think we actually spend a good part of each day cycling back and forth between them. However, when we're with a loved one in crisis, the pole that we most often swing to is fusion. Why is this so? Well, our loved one is in crisis because he or she can't cope anymore. And the breakdown in coping leads him or her to admit an awful lot of anxiety. Now, anxiety is contagious. We are quick to pick up on another person's anxiety and absorb it. I'm sure everybody listening knows what I'm talking about. And the way this picking up on anxiety, it actually happens, I think, in nanoseconds. So therefore, it's kind of outside of our awareness. But after absorbing it, we need to get rid of it because we don't like to feel anxious. So what do? Well, we usually start doing things, usually to or for the person who is in crisis, in order to get them to stop emitting so much darn anxiety. And to my loved one's anxiety that I confuse as my own feelings. Now, crisis situations pull us constantly towards fusion like a strong magnet. While some crisis situations absolutely do call for quick, concrete solutions, most often there's actually a lot more wiggle room than we think. I would argue, therefore, that we should always look for ways to increase our capacity for separateness in a crisis situation. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to bring you through two scenarios so you can better see how fusion and separateness operate. The first scenario has me becoming more and more fused, while in the second one I'm able to maintain separateness. One note about these scenarios: representative of all crisis situations, or the way people behave in these scenarios is the absolute right way to behave. Again, we're talking about principles here. We just have to understand the principles and then apply them artfully in a situation, because all situations are unique. So some background about who's involved here. And by the way, this scenario is, of course, fictional. So here we go. My younger brother lost his job a few weeks ago. This was his first job after college, and he was so excited about it. He's taken this loss hard and thinks that if he had only impressed more people with his brilliance, he would not have been let go. But the simple reality is that he was the last person hired, and so was the first person to be fired. I'm a little concerned about him because he's taken very few steps to look for more work. Next slide. So here we are on day one. I'm at work, and this morning I'm under a deadline. My brother calls me at work, and I decide to take his call because I've been worried about him. However, I don't have a lot of time to talk. He tells me that he and his girlfriend got into a huge fight last night, and his girlfriend decided to break up with him. He had been planning on proposing to her soon. She's the love of his life. He starts crying inconsolably on the phone. What do? Well, I go and tell my boss there's a family emergency, and I leave work in order to be with him. I stay with him for a few hours until he calms down, and then I return to work. I think my response shows a lot of devotion and certainly will make my brother feel loved and supported. However, I've been a little too self-sacrificing. The intensity of his emotions have made me drop everything and take immediate action. What about the fact that I have a deadline? It's like I'm not able to pause and think, but I feel compelled to spring to action. That's a good sign that fusion's happening. Next slide. Now let's fast forward a month. So here we are at day 30. My brother is still not looking for work. He stays in his room most days, and he's cut off contact with most of his friends. I'm extremely worried about him. In my spare time, I imagine scenarios about bad things happening to him. When we meet and talk, he tells me his girlfriend won't talk to him. He's a loser and that he has no future. So what I do is I have him get out his laptop and we go online together to search for jobs. I actually submit a few resumes for him. I tell him he really needs to submit a few resumes for him. I tell him he really needs to see a therapist or get some outside help. Note here how it's becoming unclear a little who is feeling whose emotions. I'm definitely anxious for him, so I want to do something to help him, yes, but also, aren't I trying to quell my own anxiety here by assuring myself I'm doing all I can for him? Notice how I'm subtly giving him the message that he can't do things for himself. And finally, if he doesn't follow my example or follow through with my advice. After all, I've showed him the right way to solve this problem. Next slide, please. And let's fast forward another month, day 60. Despite all my support, my brother is still depressed. He's even more depressed. He won't return my calls. This really upsets me. After all, I just want to help him. I find out no one's seen him for a while, so I go to his apartment, bang on his door, and he lets me in. He looks horrible. He doesn't even say hello. He just gets back in bed and turns away. Well, I just can't hold back my feelings any longer. I get angry, and I threaten to bring him to the hospital. He says nothing back to me. He stays mute. I decide well, my brother becomes enraged at me when I say that. He berates me for not caring enough about him. He commands me to get out of his house. I leave because I'm frightened. And then I go ahead and call 911 because I'm so worried about his safety. Now, we're definitely in a space where fusion is running extremely high. In fact, it is not clear anymore who is feeling whose emotions. I'm angry because I feel my brother has ignored me and all my help. But isn't this exactly how my brother must be feeling right now? Ignored by the world and angry about it? In fact, his silence is probably a coping mechanism for his anger. He says nothing because he is so afraid. His anger for him. Unfortunately, there's now a good chance my brother will later feel betrayed by me, even though, by all accounts, I'm doing the right thing. So to close, what's the principle to remember here? It's that fusion makes it difficult to sort out who is feeling whose emotions and causes us to react by coming up with concrete solutions that have the immediate goal of getting rid of anxiety. And so it happens that our best intentions for our loved one can lead to more suffering in the end. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to run through the same scenario as before, but instead of taking actions that led me to become fused with my brother, I'm going to behave in a way that keeps me engaged but separate. So let's pretend like it's Groundhog's Day. To remind everyone who's listening, here's a recap. I lost just impressed more people with his brilliance. He would not have been let go. I'm concerned about him because he's taken few steps to look for more work, but lately his friends are trying to help him with networking. Next slide. Again, day one. I'm at work under a deadline. My brother calls. I decide to take the call because I'm worried. I don't have a lot of time to talk. He tells me that he and his girlfriend got into a huge fight and she broke up with him. She's the love of his life, and he starts crying inconsolably to me. What do I do? Now, the old response was to leave work to be with him. But this time, here's what I'm going to do to keep separate. I tell him I'm really sorry to hear this news, and I attempt to console him for a little bit over the phone. Then I tell him I've got to go, and I apologize for not being able to talk longer because of work. Notice how in this response, I'm able to feel his pain, but also I bounce back to keep my own needs as a priority. Also notice how this sends the implicit message that he can survive these feelings by himself for a while. Next slide. Here we are, fast forwarding a month, day 30. My brother's still not looking for work. He stays in his room most days. He's cut off contact with his friends. I'm worried. In my spare time, I imagine scenarios where bad things happen and how to help. We set up a time to get together. I submitted resumes for him and told him he really should see a therapist. A few recent losses lately, all at once, that hurt him really badly. I tell him that he's not a loser and that he's a good person. I ask him if he has thought of seeking out help. Finally, I ask him what I can do to be helpful. Notice here how I'm not exactly doing anything to him or for him. Instead, I'm right there with him in his experience, and yet I have my own mind. I can challenge him. I can make space for him to share more about his experience by asking respectful questions. This puts him in the driver's seat, and this is precisely what he is struggling with, his own agency in the world. Next slide. Fast forwarding 30 more days, day 6. Depressed. He will not return my calls, and now I'm getting frustrated. I find out no one has seen him for a while, so I go to his apartment, bang on his door, and he lets me in. He looks horrible. He doesn't even say hello. He just gets back in bed and turns away. So remember, the fused response had me acting on my anger and anxiety. Now, though I'm frustrated, I'm separate enough to know that I need to keep my feelings at bay while focusing on his pain. So I reflect aloud that his suffering must be immense for him to act in this way. I tell him I love him very much and that I find it hard to watch him drowning like this. I join him for a while in silence. Finally, I lay out some possibilities for how he can get help if he wants. My brother opens up and begins talking to me. He tells me that he's been feeling suicidal lately. He thanks me for listening and says that he's open to the idea of getting help. He says these last few days he's been considering whether or not to call a therapist. Now again, even though the stakes are much higher here, note, I'm still focused on being with his experience first, rather than jumping in and taking control. I maintain separateness because I'm able to keep my own frustration in check while keeping the focus on my brother. It's because I respect his experience that he opens up, and because I respect his autonomy that my brother considers taking action. And so you can see we end up with my brother and me being in a much different emotional sphere than 911. Again, the principle here was that I was able to share in my brother's emotional state while maintaining my own thoughts and feelings about his situation. As a result, I didn't have to do anything to or for him to get rid of the anxiety. I was able to stay with his experience and let him take responsibility for himself. And when day 90 comes, I'll be right beside my brother again. So to close, I know many of you listening probably have lots of questions and comments about what Daniel and I have presented, but before moving on to the question and answer portion, I just want to remind everyone that this webinar was brought to you in part by Mind Freedom International. And for those of you who don't know, Mind Freedom is a nonprofit organization of individual members to win human rights and alternatives for people labeled with psychiatric disabilities. And this year is actually the 25th year for Mind Freedom doing this kind of work. For more information, people should check out mindfreedom.org. Next slide. Also, for those who joined late, Daniel and I have actually written and edited a book for people who have gone through a mental health crisis and who want to learn more about how to resolve. For those of you who don't know, Mind Freedom is a nonprofit organization of individual members to win human rights and alternatives for people labeled with psychiatric disabilities. And this year is actually the 25th year for Mind Freedom doing this kind of work. For more information, people should check out mindfreedom.org. Next slide. Also, for those who joined late, Daniel and I have actually written and edited a book for people who have gone through a mental health crisis and who want to learn more about how to resolve family conflict. Actually, for many people, resolving family conflict has been the key factor in their recovery. So to find out more about the book, you can go to Amazon.com. And now for the question and answer period.
Okay, well, thank you both, Matthew and for reminding us as well. Of the two ways to ask questions, I already have a few that I've received here, but if you click the hand button on your panel, I can unmute you so you can ask a question verbally, or you can go ahead and type a question in, and we can do it that way. And I do have a few right here that I would like to begin to read. So the first one, I will read verbatim here. So for Matthew and Daniel, it says, I'm in Chicago, and there are still no clinicians that know about alternatives. The situation we have is that my husband does not want to use medication, but is constantly bombarded with pressure to take medication by being in treatment. There is no place in Chicago that I know of where he can feel supported in finding alternatives or in simply making the choice to not use medication. So you don't have to be in Wyoming or Nebraska to not have access to clinical system that demands medication when you don't want to use medication. My husband is constantly pressured. That is the predominant view in mental health. So any comments on that from either of you?
I could go, Matthew, unless this is Daniel speaking, unless you wanted to take that.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, when a system is bombarding people to take medication and they don't want to, obviously it's extremely unpleasant for the person and for the family. The first thing is the good news is that you are in Chicago, so there actually are a lot of clinicians. It's just a question of finding them. I mean, the easiest thing I can say is, well, email me afterwards, and I probably could help you find some. The other thing is you could go to a group like isps-us.org. There's a listserv that has a lot of clinicians, and I know there's several alternatives in Chicago. But to address the principles, it's like, what does someone do if they're being bombarded to take medication and they don't want to? And I would say what could you do as a wife is first be very supportive of the person's autonomy and respect that they have real good reasons to say it. Then there's the question also of, is the person being forced to see these particular treatment providers? If they're being forced, like they're in the hospital and they're locked up, it's very, very, very hard for someone because their life has been taken control of by a hospital system. They can still say they don't want to, but it's really hard. If they're in an outpatient situation, often they have a lot more leeway. One thing is also, if a person is being pressured to take medication by treatment providers, often they're usually doing or saying something that's giving an indication that the treatment provider says this needs medication. Probably not a very good clinician because they don't know anything better. And that what I would say to a loved one, if they're constantly dealing with clinicians pressuring them, is, what are you telling them? Maybe you should be a little bit more careful of how you talk to them, because obviously something you're doing is eliciting that response from the clinician. So the autonomy goes back to the person in the situation, and that they can do things to elicit different responses from clinicians. And there's no lack of examples of this. People who are in crisis, they say one thing, they tell a clinician, I'm hearing voices. The clinician says you need medication. And then they go to the next clinician, and maybe they're like, well, maybe I should be a little wiser, be not so quick to tell that I'm hearing voices. And they have to have the clinician earn their trust before they tell them really intimate things. And then what they find, surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, is that the clinician isn't so quick to be pushing medication.
Daniel, I'm getting a couple of requests to repeat that listserv website that you mentioned earlier so I can jot it down. Out.
PS.
F as in Frank?
S, sorry. S is in Sam, P is in Paul, S is in Sam, dash US is in United States.org.
Okay.
And there's a listserv that they have. You have to be a member to stay on it for a while, but I think you can try it for a few months for free. And I have many times seen people go, and Matthew actually is one of the co-moderators of this listserv, but I think you can go on it for like 3 months, and a lot of times people come and say, does anyone know a clinician in Chicago? That's not an infrequent kind of thing that people come up. Does anyone know anyone in Coral Gables, Florida, that may be a clinician that has some sort of better insight or is a bit more progressive? So that's one. The other is, gosh, it's I think it's isepp.org. That's another website that has a lot of good clinicians on it. S as in Sam, EPP. Matthew, does that sound like a right address?
I think that's right.
Okay, we'll check those and I'll email those out to the group so people have that. Here and
Could I just ask Matthew, did you have anything you wanted to add to what I said? Because I don't know how you felt I handled that question.
No, actually, yeah, that was excellent. Nothing to add.
Okay, Patrice. Patrice, if you're out there, you are unmuted and ready to speak your question. If you're there, Patrice. Hello.
Hi.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to Patrice. Raymond. Ray Federici. Raymond.
Yes. I had a question regarding, I had done a training when I was working in on the ACT team, and we talked about vicarious trauma and talk about self-care for outreach and fusion. Kind of hit on the vicarious trauma that, you know, that I got a good example of my daughter getting stung by a bee and how much trauma and anxiety I feel, and how I've learned, been self-aware about how much is it my stuff or is it her stuff, and what am I reacting to? I don't know whether that's somewhat similar to what you were talking about with separateness and fusion.
Yeah, I'll take that. I'm sorry, it's Frank? Is that
Ray?
Raymond.
Ray, I'm sorry. Yeah, Ray, actually, exactly. The hard thing is that, you know, like I say, it has to do, it's almost like a matter of time, of temporality, because these emotions almost, it's like they operate on a sphere, a plane of existence, which happens in nanoseconds. And so it's like, before we know it, the charge of anxiety is already filled us, and it happens completely outside of our awareness. And so it does take a lot of practice to, you know, get that mindset where you can pause and kind of check in with yourself and say, now, you know, what's going on here internally for me? You know, what, like you said, you know, what is my stuff here, and what's not. Of course, you know, you have to kind of employ that day in and day out in practice. So you can get good at it. But even with people who are your own loved ones, we often can forget this. So yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. And I'm going to try another person here. Philippa, I hope I'm saying that right. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Lovely. I was thinking, in my experience,
And so it does take a lot of practice to, get that mindset where you can pause and kind of check in with yourself and say, now, what's going on here internally for me? What, like you said, what is my stuff here, and what's not. Of course, you have to kind of employ that day in and day out in practice. So you can get good at it. But even with people who are your own loved ones, we often can forget this. So yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. And I'm going to try another person here. Philippa, I hope I'm saying that right. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Lovely. I was thinking, in my experience, people with mental health problems are frequently in relationships with other people with mental health problems, and either can be considered to be kind of the carer. Any given specific advice for those situations, people in those situations?
Daniel, do you have any? Do you want to?
Sure, I can try it quick. So just to make sure I get it, so people are often, who have mental health problems, are often in relationships. I suppose you meant like romantic relationships, like partners?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So what happens in situations where people have their own problems but are a carer for someone else who's having problems? Was that it?
Yes.
Well, I think all the more reason to really try to be as healthy as one can possibly be, to work out our own issues, to be really clear about who we are, who the other person is, what our own issues are, because otherwise it's like, I think it's like one person has a problem, another person has a problem. It's not like 1 + 1 = 2. It's like 1 + 1 = about 7 sometimes. It's like the problem, live a healthy lifestyle, nurture ourselves as carefully as we can, so when we're in a relationship with someone else who's having problems, our stuff doesn't spill out onto theirs, which is so easy to happen anyway, let alone when both people have more serious issues going on.
Yeah, I think I'd just add to that too that we all, I think people who get into mental and emotional trouble, part of what is going on is this: they are struggling with what I'm calling fusion and separateness, and we all do. That's part of the human condition. But I think a lot of the more acute and long-standing issues that can kind of go on with folks really do precisely involve that kind of dynamic. You've got a person who is really struggling with fusion and separateness in love with another person who's really, really struggling with fusion and separateness. And I think things can get really tangled up really quickly. Again, like for all of us, really, but there's definitely a way where, like Daniel's saying, learning about yourself and taking care of yourself and being as healthy as as healthy as you can be is the best way that those people could help each other.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more verbal question. I encourage anyone who didn't get to type in a question if they can, because we do get a log of the questions and we will do our best to answer them.
Great.
Mark, are you there, Mark?
Brilliant. Great, great presentation today. I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
this has been very enlightening, and this is sort of a discussion, in effect, in part, and a question as well. Please. Part of what I understand as I listen to both of these presentations, which seem to me to be, woven together, is that and I want to talk from a point of view of being a friend of someone who's mentally ill, who's been in a psychotic state for a few years. And the question has come up is, well, that's the psychosis talking. You know, well, he's ill. You know, he'll say, help me out. Did you, Trent? He cut you off. And, you know, he'll act, you know, perhaps, you know, spoiled, pouty and things like that. And then, you know, and there's a great deal of work that goes into trying to reestablish trust and even contact for the parents. I was very close, and then, you know, he drifts away and things. And it came to me, and as I hear this, that we need to speak to him in a way, in a very similar way, and take care of ourselves in the way, and as you mentioned Al-Anon, Daniel, how someone who's dealing with a drug addict in some ways.
Mm.
Is that right?
Yeah, I guess I was using it as an analogy.
Because it seems to make an enormous amount of money. In the everydayness of this.
Yeah, it's actually an interesting thing that I said Al-Anon, because now that I think about it, in my experience of being in Al-Anon, is there are a lot of people who actually go to Al-Anon to talk about a person that they're in a relationship with or a family member who's having really serious emotional or mental problems. And they're saying, well, actually, my family member or the person I'm coming here for is not an alcoholic, but actually has emotional or mental problems. And actually, I just feel like I get a lot of support in this group because people understand really good principles of how to work here. So, yeah, I guess it's an analogy, and it's also sometimes more than an analogy.
But my question is, in part, and it makes a lot of sense to me, but the idea is that even if the person's in a psychotic state, do we still put some demands on them? And I use that word, you know, loosely in a way. But do we still put the demands on them, you know, in part that, you know, your life is worth living? You know, not that you demand that of them. See, the question becomes is, what if these people are ill in in such a way that they just don't want to take care of themselves, and that we start to impose our idea of what a healthful life is. Mm. And see, and this is where fusion comes in to me, because then you know, well, this is my child. How do I stay connected and help them? But also, how do I help? You know, where do I stay separate? You know, there's this. It's very gray to me. Am I making sense?
No, it is gray. It is hard to sort through, and you know, I think one of the things that people often forget in doing or you know, doing and saying things that could be considered psychotic is that there is always a part of that person who is an adult. Mm. And you want to try and reach that part. That part never, ever goes away.
It doesn't. So it's always there. So you have to speak to that, right? You can't just say, well, they're mentally ill.
That's right. That's right. I
and
mean,
so
why does this, like, you know, when a person's in a psychotic episode, you know, they don't try and walk through closed doors. You know, they don't, they behave in ordinary reality as everybody else would in a sense. They just do and say certain things that cause great alarm in everybody around them. But there's a part of them that sits them around. That's the part that is the adult part. And that part can be strengthened, and I kind of, you know, I'm pretty much of the opinion that, you know, that's the part that's kind of what therapy does in a way with somebody in that state, is it reaches more and more to that adult part of them who can get back in the driver's seat and begin to get a handle on all these intense emotions and thoughts And family members can help with that by giving appropriate boundaries, letting the person face the consequences of choices, letting them know that they have choices and that they're making certain choices, not in a mean-spirited way, but it's just a fact. So
see, this is the part that's missing here, is that this young man to face the consequences of his choices, because as the family understands it, he's mentally ill. You know, that there's a conundrum there.
right. Yeah, it's a tough boundary too between sort of like tough love and compassion, you know. And I don't know about you, Daniel, but I'm, you know, tough love. I'm not a huge. There seems to be like this kind of aggression, passive-aggressive component to tough love. There can be, and it's kind of tricky to sort through. It's like, well, now we're going to punish you because you don't go along with what we say and do.
That's right. Not tough love. That's just tough.
Yeah, maybe you want to speak to that, Daniel, or you know.
Yeah, well, it's complicated. Like, I think I didn't catch your name, sir. I'm sorry.
My name is Mark Oppenheimer, and in part, JRC should be part of your answer, right?
Oh,
in terms of,
yeah, that's a whole different discussion, which would be interesting. But Mark, yeah, I think the key is first is the gray area is huge. What I was thinking as I was listening to you is I had so much that I wanted to say to really address this subject in all the detail it deserves. It needs hours and hours.
I understand.
Because the gray area is so huge. It's like, just listening to the story, I was thinking, well, this person you're talking about, if he's been going through crisis for several years, that you must really like him to hang in there with him. And that,
well, you know who he is. I just don't want to say it on the phone. But
actually, I don't. I haven't realized who it is, to be honest.
Okay.
But I guess I'm thinking you must like this person a lot, and they must have some really good qualities. And most people, when people hang with someone for a really long time and hang in there with them, the person has really good qualities. And I think that the thing we like about people is their mature adult side, and how to
see the family and whose son is ill.
Right.
And
right.
I've been trying to get him to get help because I go, dude, you don't have the skills to figure this out by yourself. You need Will or Daniel Mackler, you know, to help you with this. And you know, and I mean and when my brother was a crack addict, I called my drug addict buddies. I said, what do I do? And they say, this is what you do. And I say, well, it's the same with this young man. You need to go to people who understand how to deal with someone who's in psychosis and how to make them accountable for their life. I mean, we can't impose our idea of how they should live, but don't they have to be accountable? I mean, you know what I mean? I mean, accountable. So.
Yeah, the accountability is a big thing because the accountability is actually just reality. That's how reality works. And tough love or whatever you want to call it, it's like the problem with it is sometimes there's not a lot of love with it. But to really be loving, but to also to respect someone, that if they do things that can be pretty offensive, that people in the world do pull away from people like that, and sometimes that can be very helpful for people to learn. Sometimes it's like we give people a bit more leeway if we recognize they're confused or they're not aware of their consequences sometimes. But even that, the leeway gets a little old after time. But gosh, I wish we had an hour to talk about just this.
Yeah, and I hate to. Yeah. I hate to.
You can cut me off. I mean, only cut me off. There could be tough love here for me.
We are running a little bit over, so I would like to again encourage anyone to type in any last-minute questions, and we'll try to see how best we can address those. Once again, the presentation and webinar will be available on the Mind Freedom website, as well as Mary Ellen Copeland's Rap and Recovery Books site. A few days and find them when you can. Thank you very much to Matthew and Daniel and to everyone who participated in this. But I thought that it was a wonderful topic and very informative and very helpful. So again, thank you everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Are we done?
We are done.
Is there a way that I could ever talk to Daniel or Matthew again?
I would say, Mark, where are we here?
Google me. You can find my website. My email is at the bottom.
You can find you on Google?
Yes, same with me.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
Google
Gentlemen,
either of us.
thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Matthew, you still there?
Yes.
How about I give you a call?
Okay, sounds good.